We're going to discover that it is possible to do a mitzvah in a way that is 100% compliant, and it's still not the ultimate way to do the mitzvah. It's going to start off with the way we understand Shemitah, the way we understand Sfiras HaOmer, and a few other examples along the way. Let's start with something about Shemitah. If in Pasuk, Shav Saharet Shabbos Lashem, in this week's parasha tells us, as B'shana Shviz Davdi Ed Ruin, that in the 7th year the earth has to rest, which is what we call Shemitah. And we're not allowed to work the fields or the vineyards, etc. So bring the Zohar and Pasuk. So the Zohar relates to the story of Shemitah, a different Pasuk, all the way from Parshas Mishpatim. That when you acquire a Jewish slave, he can only work for 6 years. In the 7th year, he goes free. So the Zohar now links the two of them. Every single Jewish person gets to rest from work during the Shemitah year. So at the same time that the earth is resting, the servants are also supposed to rest. In dem ruin, von der darf nicht die Knecht ruin. That's the Yiddish of the same thing. Therefore, the Zohar says, in the 7th year, the slave goes free. So what does that look like? With Pashtus Zetos, it would appear as the Zohar lent pshatim b'ashvis yetzel chav shechinam. It would appear that what the Zohar is interpreting from that pasuk in Mishpatim, that in the 7th year the slave goes free, doesn't mean the 7th year of his tenure. It doesn't mean nicht dem 7th year from when he was given an eved. It's not the 7th year from when he became a slave. But that when it's Shemitah, the 7th year for the entire community, that's when the eved goes free. Now that's really strange. It's bavus ditmiyah. So people raise a question on this. And what's the question? It's a well-known and established halacha, brought in various sources, as an eved that the time the eved ivri goes free, it's not specifically the Shemitah, not b'shvis the mechira, but the 7th year after he was sold as a slave. So how's the Zohar coming with a suggestion? At that time, when the earth is resting, that's when the slaves get to rest, so to speak, in other words, go free. We certainly cannot suggest, as the Zohar is that the Zohar has a different opinion to pretty much every source that we have in Nigla de Torah. So what is the Zohar telling us over here? In order to understand that, we're going to speak about the principle that when you do a mitzvah, there is the lechatchila ideal version of doing the mitzvah, and the b'di'eved, under certain circumstances, you have to satisfy yourself with a lesser version of doing the mitzvah. So wenn man das verstehen, behekten, was man gefindt, wenn er geht zu mitzvahs, we can understand this based on this principle, that with regards to mitzvahs, hasfaran achim ha-mitzvah in an ofen von der lechatchila, there is a way to do the mitzvah, which is the first way that you should do it, the ideal way that you should do it, what the Torah would prefer. And then there is another possibility of doing the mitzvah where you absolutely fulfill the mitzvah, but it's b'di'evet. It's not the ideal way to do it. It's because of circumstance or because you don't have an alternative. Okay, now what's interesting about this is it's not only that if it's a rabbinic law we give you two options, the ideal way to do it or the secondary way of doing it, but the Achronim point out that even in a mitzvah, the oraisa, there are mitzvahs where there's a lechatchila way and a b'di'evet way that still absolutely counts. Right now that's a little abstract. Once we start to get into the examples, it will make more sense. Nochmer. Nicht nur, wenn jetzt also Reproten von der Mitzvah. Tonight's study, we're going to discover that not only is it that certain, so to speak, tangential elements of the mitzvah, if they're not fulfilled, it's okay, the mitzvah will still go ahead anyway. Was dermal kemen verstehen as I feel when it's felt out at night, because then it would make sense to us. Okay, that's something which is not so central to the mitzvah. So if it's missing, ultimately given the mitzvah kol panim b'di'evet. So we get it, at least we've done the mitzvah. What we're going to find, which is so surprising, is now seine Frauen fallen there are circumstances. Was der Prat is in guf in a mitzvah, that there's something which is integral to the mitzvah itself. Und afal bichein is das nicht a tnai leikuva. And even though it is something which is integral to the mitzvah, it is not a condition on which the mitzvah does or doesn't hinge. So what does that mean? Mekayim the mitzvah b'di'evet on dem Prat. It means that it is possible to fulfill the mitzvah 100% without that key detail of the mitzvah. And there are various examples that are brought. And probably the most glaring of them all is the klal by Yonik Kochim, the klal that we're taught by Kochim. The Gemara brings it in Yuma, but it's brought in other places as well. That when it comes to the korbanos that the Kohen Gadol has to bring on Yom Kippur, so the Torah repeats the fact that it's for him, so you shouldn't mistakenly think that the animal could belong to somebody else, and if that detail is not there, the entire mitzvah is disqualified, implying that the Torah sometimes goes out of its way to tell us that a detail is that critical to a mitzvah, that without that detail, the mitzvah is not a mitzvah, implying that in other circumstances, a critical detail could be absent and the mitzvah is still a mitzvah. So with that in mind, so we've got this principle which says there's the ideal way to do a mitzvah, but there is the possibility in certain circumstances that a key part of the mitzvah is missing and the mitzvah is still absolutely acceptable. With that information, we could look at a few different examples and then eventually come back to the one about what the Zohar is saying about Shemitah. So we're going to use this to be able to resolve a whole lot of unusual or difficult concepts to understand. And out of the many possibilities, we're going to look at a few specific examples. We'll start with something which is relevant at this time of the year, which is Sfiras HaOmer. We know very well that the way that the Torah presents the mitzvah Sfiras HaOmer is that you start counting the day after Shabbos, which we would ordinarily just imagine means the day after Shabbos. And in fact, that was the big contention of the Tzedukim who reject Torah Shabbal Peh, that the Torah is saying that you have to start the counting of the Omer after the first Shabbos that follows Pesach. As men hope on Selen Sfira from the Mochas Yom HaShabbos, you don't count as we do the second day of Pesach, but you actually wait until whenever the first Motzei Shabbos is going to be. But that's not the case. But Torah Shabbal Peh, even though the Torah says Me'mochas HaShabbos, Torah Shabbal Peh tells us is Mephorish Me'mochas HaShabbos mean Me'mochas Yom Tov. That actually, in that context, when it says Shabbos, it means Yom Tov. It's referring to the first day of Pesach, and therefore you count Sfira from the second night of Pesach. And V'chazal bring the Ruf Kama V'chamerayis V'limudim, as is well known, that this is something substantiated by a whole series of proofs that Chazal bring. Now, what's strange about this is, why doesn't the Torah just say it straight? It's l'chayra tomor. It's bewildering. If the Torah really wants us to start counting Sfira after the first day of the Yom Tov of Pesach is over, so why say something which could be misunderstood, that you start counting the day after Shabbos? Which could mislead us. Why doesn't the Torah use language that would be much more clear, like, for example, the day after Pesach begins, that's when you start counting the Yomer. So now that we have this principle which says there's an ideal version of a mitzvah, but there's an acceptable version of the mitzvah even if that ideal is not fulfilled, that helps us understand this principle, or this mitzvah. So that's going to help us understand it. But first, let's just put one other detail into the picture. So far, we've spoken about the fact that as an individual, you may get to fulfill the mitzvah in the ideal fashion, or you may, due to your circumstances, get to fulfill the mitzvah in a less than ideal situation. So if, for whatever reason, you miss out one of the key components of the mitzvah, that is not an absolute condition of the mitzvah, you've still done the mitzvah. That's with regards to the practitioner, the person who's doing the mitzvah. But now we're going to discover, sometimes the mitzvah itself can exist in two possible formats. As in gewisse Matzavim is the mitzvah mit mehr Shleimus. The way the mitzvah is set up is that sometimes the mitzvah is done with more, so to speak, completion. Whereas there's another part and parcel of how the mitzvah was set up in the first place, as in der Matzah tut man the mitzvah nicht b'shleimus. It's actually set up in such a way that you're given an option to do the mitzvah that is not the ideal way to do the mitzvah. Certain of the details which were really valuable to the mitzvah and central to the mitzvah don't actually have to be there when the mitzvah happens in a different set of circumstances. The easiest example to illustrate this would be Yom Tov. As long as there's a Beis HaMikdash, a key element of Yom Tov is that you bring certain karbanos, both as a community and as individuals. Karbanos Yom Tov shel tzibur, there's the musafim brought on behalf of the community. And shel yachid, and then there are the personal offerings that you had to bring as part of your pilgrimage to go to the Beis HaMikdash. Now, Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, automatically Yom Tov minat Torah. So what happens? There's no Beis HaMikdash now. Is Yom Tov no longer mandated by the Torah? No, it's 100% a mitzvah from the Torah. Aber on the karbanos, but it's missing one of the key components, which is karbanos. And it's not that the Yom Tov is now downgraded, it's 100% Yom Tov, just without one of its key components, because that's how the mitzvah was designed. There's an ideal way to do it in a Beis HaMikdash with korbanos, and there's an equally acceptable way to do it if the circumstances of the mitzvah are that there's no Beis HaMikdash and therefore no korbanos. The truth is that even at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, there were individuals who kept Yom Tov differently to other individuals. Because if somebody did not own land in Eretz Yisrael, they'd be exempt from that pilgrimage to the Beis HaMikdash. And therefore they obviously didn't bring those korbanos, those personal korbanos of Re'iyah and Chagiga. But that person was still obligated to observe Yom Tov with the full force of a mitzvah in the Torah, illustrating to us that it is possible that the Torah presents a mitzvah that in different circumstances is observed differently. And that's not because Yom Tov is a main topic and one of the subtopics is bringing the korbanos and going to the Beis HaMikdash. So not only is that not true, that they're a sidebar, but rather the korbanos seien nicht am Subbe von Yom Tov, also seine Chelek al kol ponim ha'isofin shleimus b'inyan ha'Yom Tov gufa. It would even be inaccurate to say that because there's a Yom Tov, one of the consequences of there being a Yom Tov is an obligation to bring a korban. It's more than that. It's how this is a Yom Tov is that it is a day you go to the Beis HaMikdash and you bring a korban. That's part of what makes it a Yom Tov. And yet, if circumstances are such that the Torah does not give you the opportunity, because you can't bring a korban without a Beis HaMikdash, the Yom Tov is 100% in place. The holiness of the Yom Tov is no less than it was, and there is a great example of a mitzvah that should be performed ideally in one way, and yet is 100% valid if that particular key element is missing. Noch mehr gefindt man, it goes further than that. As seine Faran mitzvahs, was einem Chetchile gegeben geworden in an Eifen, as Faran in der Mitzvah zwei Zmanim. That was an example where the mitzvah is given for this circumstance and also operates in different circumstances. But there are certain mitzvahs where the mitzvah lechatchila was given with two different time frames associated with the mitzvah, and again Yom Tov will be the ideal example. In ein Zman is the Faran b'shleimus b'chol hapratim. One time frame of this mitzvah is when you do the mitzvah with all of its requirements. In einer zweiten Zman hat sie nicht die Shleimus, and in a different time frame, that same mitzvah is performed without all of that detail or completion. Great example of that would be you have Pesach, you have Sukkot, divided into two parts: the Yom Tov part and the Chol HaMoed part. Chol HaMoed is that tail for Yom Tov. There's no question that Chol HaMoed is part of Yom Tov. As Bechlal from Moed and Simcha, it's a time that you have to celebrate. And it's a celebration as mandated by the Torah, which includes Ein Simcha leBabaser, Ein Simcha leBayayin. But nobody is going to suggest that Chol HaMoed is as much an expression and experience and celebration of Yom Tov as the Yom Tov itself is. Because on the actual Yom Tov, those days are filled with all of the detail that a Yom Tov requires. So now that we understand this principle, that you could have the same mitzvah, which is observed in two totally different, well, not totally, but two different ways, where one is much more complete than the other, let's plug that back into Sfiras HaOmer, because we just assume that there's this big debate between us and the Tzedukim, and there's no validity to what they're saying. That can't be the case, because the Torah did use the word Shabbos. That means the Torah is telling us that there are two possibilities of how Sfiras HaOmer happens, an ideal and the ordinary. When it gets to mitzvah Sfira. The fact that the Torah tells us to start to count Sfira the day after Shabbos, even though we know that the correct time to start counting Sfira is actually after the first day of Yom Tov. Why does the Torah say it that way? Because should the first day of Pesach actually be on Shabbos, and therefore we're starting to count Sfira not only on the second day of Pesach after Yom Tov, but also after Shabbos. That is as we're about to prove a little bit later from a medrash. That's actually the ideal way to count Sfiras HaOmer, is when it coincides with coming straight after Shabbos. Das heißt, in other words, as the mitzvah von Sfira is melchatchila gegeben geworden in zwei Oifanim, which means that when Sfiras HaOmer was presented to us as a mitzvah, it was presented with two valid options. The Etzem mitzvah von Sfira, there's the fundamental mitzvah, which is you've got to count the days from Pesach till Shavuos. Was is Makeh b'di'evet? If you miss that, you've missed the mitzvah. On muss sein in jeder Sfira in was for quiz soll noch sein. And the requirement is you've got to count in the order, you can't skip a day along the way, and that's no matter what day of the week you begin or end. It's as long as it's the day straight after the beginning of Pesach, the day of the week is not important. In addition to which is an even higher version of Sfira Somer, when the first day of Pesach is on a Shabbos, then when you're counting Sfira Somer, it's even more perfect. Why is it more perfect? Because you're counting, as the Torah says, from Pesach till Shavuos, and you're counting as the Torah literally said, Mimachas HaShabbos. So therefore, why does the Torah, in a sense, create the possibility of misunderstanding by saying the day after Shabbos? Why? Because that's the ideal. And obviously you present a mitzvah typically in the ideal way to fulfill it, and then afterwards say, and there are other options. Now we'll take that a step deeper with this medrash. So our insight to really solidify this understanding that Sfira Somer operates in two possible ways is from what seems to be a really strange medrash on the pasuk about Sfira Somer. Let's read it. The Torah tells us that there's supposed to be 7 complete weeks. So when are they complete weeks? It's when these two families of Kohanim don't actually get to have their. Remember, there's the rotation, the 24 families of Kohanim, and everybody gets their week that they have to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. So if these two families don't get a turn between Pesach and Shavuos, that's when you've got the perfect way to count Sfira Somer. What does that mean? The only way this would happen is if the first day of Sfira Somer begins on a Motzei Shabbos. That is how these two families who normally are around about this time of the year would be on either end, one before Sfira Somer at Pesach and one after Sfira Somer at Shavuos, and they wouldn't actually be in that space between Pesach and Shavuos. And the Medrash gibt das Simen auf der Kvius, wenn Pesach fällt ist Shabbos. So isn't it intriguing? What's the sign that the Medrash decided to use to identify when it is that Pesach falls on a Shabbos? As the Mishmoris, Yeshua, V'Shachanyo, aber nicht getan kann Avodah b'Mikdash bein Pesach la'atzeres. They draw our attention to the fact that you've got these two families who don't get their Mishmar to be on duty between Pesach and Shavuos. So that's going to illustrate to us that if your first night of counting Sfira Somer is a Motzei Shabbos, then you have each week of Sfira Somer aligning with a week of the cycle of the calendar. And if the family of Yeshua is in that period, that's an indicator that obviously the weeks are not starting on a Motzei Shabbos and they're not, so to speak, pure. It says Tamor, it's so strange. The Chiyav Inyan from Tamimus is B'chol Shana V'Shana. The Torah, when it tells us that we have to count 7 complete weeks, that's any time we count Sfira Somer, which is annually. By Yeda Kavius, no matter how it falls out. Was der Far, wenn Shachach Lisboir, Shuvenim Avarech, Sfira Somer is mi Shuvenim Avarech, Sfira Somer is mi Ba'erev. So 2 things that emerge from that. That you've always got to count Sfira Somer in the evening. If you miss a day, the next evening you can't count to the bracha. Why? Because it has to be tmimois. They have to be complete weeks. So then why is the Medrash suggesting that the only time that the weeks are really considered complete is if they start on a Motzei Shabbos? And the worst part of this is, it actually seems to support the argument of the Tzedukim and the Baitusim. Asfira hopes on ständig from Mochas Yom Shabbos because they believe that Sfira Somer should always begin on a Motzei Shabbos. The minute the Medrash says, well, that's actually the best way to do it, you can see the Tzedukim by Tusim dancing in the streets and saying, you see, the Medrash supports us. Is the beer in them, so therefore the explanation based on what we've already discussed. Bezman as Mehot Shabbos is Tmimus Kesheshis in Bereshis, when Sfira Somer aligns with the order of the weeks. Is das Tmimus Bishlemus? That is the ideal way to count Sfira Somer. Not the shlemus is not makeh b'di'evet. But if that shlemus is not there, if we don't have the ideal way to count Sfira Somer starting on a Motzei Shabbos, it doesn't upend the mitzvah. The only thing that interferes with fulfilling the mitzvah Sfiras HaOmer is if it's not complete in the sense that I didn't count all 49 days. Aber Shleimus in Yinan HaTmimus is when es ist Tmimus, K'sheishem Eibreishis, Pesach Shechol B'Shabbos, but the very best ideal way to fulfill Sfiras HaOmer is when it actually begins on a Motzei Shabbos. Okay, so now that we know this principle, im keinim advarim, if this is a valid principle, which obviously it is, that there are times where the Torah describes a mitzvah in its most ideal form, where every single possible value is included in the mitzvah. Even though those details are not necessarily all things which derail the mitzvah completely. That will give us insight into something that we're told about Shavuos as a Yom Tov, which also really seems to be very strange when you think about it. In fact, it's such a glaring issue, surprising that we don't think about it. We know the Gemara tells us what day of the month is Shavuos. Depends. Piyamim Chamisha, Piyamim Shisha, Piyamim Shiva. Could be on the 5th of Sivan, could be on the 6th, could be on the 7th. Now, of course, that's talking about in the days where they were Mekadesh al Piyariyah, where you did not know in advance how the month was going to be. It depended if there were witnesses to see the new moon of Rosh Chodesh, and therefore, depending how Nisan and Iyar work out, that will determine if Shavuos is going to be the 5th, the 6th, or the 7th. Das heißt, you know what that means? This is the glaring question that we should all have. In the days when we followed the system as we're supposed to identify the new moon and only then announce the new month, that would mean that sometimes Shavuos is not B'Matan Torah Seinu. It's not actually the anniversary of the giving of the Torah. Which, according to most opinions, is the 6th of Sivan, or the debate in the Gemara Shabbos that it could have been the 7th of Sivan. So that raises such a glaring question. Men gefindt as Chazal verbinden dem Tag von Shavuos mit dem Tag von Matan Torah. It is so obvious that our Chazal link the date of Shavuos, the celebration of Shavuos, with the day of getting the Torah. Wer sagt in Yerushalmi, as der Tam, was bei die Karbonis von Atzeret steht nicht in Pasuk de Lashon Chet, if you have a look at the in Parshas Pinchas, where it describes the Musafin of the various Yomim Tovim, it says Sir Izim Echad Lechatos, except on Shavuos. There it just says Sir Izim Echad. Doesn't say anything about a Chatos. Says the Yerushalmi, why is there no mention of the word Chet? So if you back Karbonis from the other Yomim Tovim, like the other Yomim Tovim, is Mekevan Shekibaltem Aleichem Ol Torah. Says the Yerushalmi, it's because the Eibush is telling us, today is the day that you accepted the yoke of my Torah, therefore I will consider today as if you've never sinned. So therefore no mention of the word Chet on this day. Das heißt, so there it's pretty clear that the Shavuos is very much linked to the day of giving the Torah. How could it actually then not always be on that date? Using the principle that we've now developed, it makes sense. The whole purpose of counting Sfiras HaOmer is to get us to Matan Torah. As we well know that the Medrash tells us, and Rishonim quoted as well, that the Yidden was so excited and impatient to receive the Torah. So as soon as they left Mitzrayim, they started counting the days. How many days closer to receiving the Torah are we? Which tells us that the whole purpose of the Sfira, which is over 49 days, is to get us to that 50th, completely transcendent day of Shavuos. To plug it into the language of Chassidus, through that preparation of counting the 49 days, which associate with 49 levels or gates of understanding, that prepares us for a 50th day, Shar Anun, which is the 50th gate of Bina, which is what the giving of the Torah is all about, opening up gates of wisdom and understanding that humans are not really capable of achieving, and the Eibishter has to give it to us as a gift. As the Yom HaChamishim was nicht ausfallen in dem Tag von Kabbalas HaTorah. So, what's interesting about this is, the way the calendar works is you count Sfiras HaOmer, you might arrive at a date, which is day 50, which is the whole purpose that we're preparing for, to celebrate Matan Torah, and it's not actually the day of Matan Torah. In fact, it might even be before the anniversary of the date of Matan Torah. Von deswegen, Wenn Atzeres Yom HaChamishim fällt ois in dem Tag von Kabbalas HaTorah. So Sfiras Omer is absolutely valid, and Shavuos is absolutely valid if 49 days after Pesach does not get us to the 6th of Sivan. But what's better is when it does. It's just not no azach adav tzedodi no dishlemis and atzeres gufa. When Shavuos is on the correct date, so it's the 50th day after beginning to count Omer, and it is the 6th of Sivan. That's ideal. That's the ideal version of the mitzvah. The shlemis von Yom HaChamishim is when das ist the tag von kibaltem alechem el Torah matan Torah. That's what the Yerushalmi is effectively telling us. That the ultimate goal of the 50th day is not just to conclude Sfiras Omer, but the ideal is when it's also the day that celebrates matan Torah. In the tag von Kabbalas HaTorah. So therefore, the ideal state is when it coincides with the date of Kabbalas HaTorah. Therefore, the Rebbe sagt, Yerushalmi steht nicht in Torah, shebechsav bei Atzeres de Loshen Chet. Therefore, when the Torah, which is obviously going to describe the ideal version of this mitzvah, talks about it, it leaves out the word Chet, because as the Yerushalmi mentioned, on the anniversary of Kabbalas HaTorah, there's no room for Chet. So far we've used examples where a single mitzvah has two possible ways that it could be manifest. Yom Tov with karbanos or without karbanos. Yom Tov versus Chol HaMoed. Sfiras HaOmer when it's Motzei Shabbos, when it's not Motzei Shabbos. Shavuos when it is on the 6th of Sivan, in the time of Mekachan Apiria, or not. The same principle can apply when you have two mitzvahs that are in fact unique mitzvahs, but share a common theme. As in ein mitzvah is a teichen mitzvah b'shleimus, und bei der zweiten mitzvah ist das nicht b'shleimusai. So you can have the one way that the mitzvah is performed, or the one mitzvah is the ultimate ideal form of the mitzvah, and the other mitzvah, which is so similar, just not as ideal. What would be an example of that? The different mitzvahs we have around recalling Yetzias Mitzrayim. Lo dogma. Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. Was versteht von zwei besondere mitzvahs? The mitzvah to recall Yetzias Mitzrayim is actually two independent mitzvahs. One mitzvah is to tell the story of the Exodus on Pesach. The other mitzvah is to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim every day, all throughout the year. Kol yemei chayecha, as we say in the Haggadah. Even though they're two mitzvahs with exactly the same message, Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, there are very major differences between how you fulfill the mitzvah and the two different time frames. Every single day to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim is effectively to say that. That's it, finished, done. You said the words, you remembered Yetzias Mitzrayim. No details. And it doesn't have the same emphasis as on Pesach night, where you've got to tell the whole story, and you have to have symbolism, and matzah morim unachin lefanecha. The Tamad is moving b'pashtas, and it's quite obvious why that is. It's incredibly obvious. Because there's man for Yetzias Mitzrayim kipshutis belel tezvav v'nisan, because Pesach night is the anniversary of the Exodus. And the Rebbe is Yetzias Mitzrayim b'layla zeh in anoifa for tachlis hashleimus, and needless to say, that's the time where the way that you remember Yetzias Mitzrayim has to be the ultimate way to remember it. Whereas the rest of the year, where we also have a mitzvah to recall Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's not Tetzov and the Chiyuv El Pesach. That's just an outgrowth of the fact that on Pesach we have to recall the Yetzias Mitzrayim. Because once we remember Yetzias Mitzrayim on Pesach, we realize that it wasn't a once-off event, but actually it's an ongoing impact on our lives. That's why we have to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim every single day of our lives. Is man made verstandig, as this schira is nicht mit as ashleimus with the schira von El Pesach. So it's very obvious that the recalling of Yetzias Mitzrayim during the rest of the year is not the same as, and doesn't have the same level of intensity as it is on the night of Pesach. Again, to our theme that there is an ideal version of a mitzvah and a less ideal version of the mitzvah, and they're both absolutely valid. Now, we're going to relate that to something which is outside of the realm of mitzvahs per se. So another example, not a mitzvah example, is So we're going to look at a Mishnah in Shkolim, and immediately think, 1 second, something over here doesn't make sense, and then our principle is going to help explain it. Steht im Medrash, im Mishnah. Elu heina mamunim shahayu b'mikdash. The Mishnah wants to tell us which families or which groups of people of kohanim were responsible for various things in the Beis Hamikdash. The Mishnah rechnet euch den Namen von den Mamunim. Und if was für ein Aveda wegen dem Mikdash ist jeder von sich gewesen Mamuna. So it gives us a name and then tells us, and that person or that family was responsible for this particular undertaking in the Beis Hamikdash. So Yochanan ben Pinchas alachei somos in charge of the stamps that you used to use for korbanos. When Mefarshim bringen in them zwei pirushim. So Mefarshim said there's two things that the two possibilities of what the Mishnah wants to tell us. Either aleph ksheir kol dor v'dor bodam manis. Either the Mishnah is identifying for us who are, so to speak, the most eligible people in the community in each generation. Or or they were speaking about the people in their own generation, kind of like almost speaking from experience. Now it's the Cheret Amor. The question in this Mishnah is, this is a Mishnah. The purpose of Mishnah really is to tell us the basics of halacha, which will later be expanded in the Gemara and ratified in the Shulchan Aruch. That's the goal of Mishnah. So why does it have to tell us the nemen fundim imunim b'derech shelifnim? Why does it have to tell us once upon a time there was so and so who was in charge of this particular job? We could ask the question the Gemara asks in various places. What happened? It's not relevant to knowing the halacha now. So we're going to understand this principle based on what the Bartanura says. That the Mishnah is recording the very first people who were ever given these particular responsibilities, telling us their names. Because the first person in each scenario who was given this particular role was called so-and-so, the tradition became that the heir to their position took their name. Why would they do that? The explanation is this. Names are not arbitrary. Each name is an expression of the characteristics and the nature of the person who has that name. As we know, the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Meir was very careful about a person's name, paid attention because it told him a lot about the person. Let's draw that back to the Mishnah in Shkolim. The reason that so-and-so was given that job and so-and-so was given that job, the reason for that is it's because that role needs a person with that characteristic, and that role needs a person with that characteristic. So we look out for those people who are suited to the particular role. And those characteristics are reflected in the person's name. So that's why the name of so-and-so is important to us, because it tells us what kind of a person needs that job. From that Mishnah, we can now work out that in future generations, where we have to appoint successors to those particular roles, we have to look for people who have the characteristics that deserve that name, so they can actually take that name as their own, not because it's an arbitrary thing that the person with that job has that name, but because that's who they are, and therefore they're suited to the job. But the fact that the later custodians of these particular jobs obviously had their own names first. And only once they took the role were they then given this title name, which is derived from the name of the original person. That must illustrate that these people were not as ideal or as intense in these particular characteristics. They had something of the characteristic which you are supposed to have in order to take this role. But they were not, so to speak, masters of this particular set of characteristics as the original Kohanim were. Same principle as what we've said about mitzvahs, that sometimes you have the ideal version and sometimes the less ideal version, and they're both valid in order to fulfill the mitzvah, or in this case, in order to take the role. So let's take that all back to the Zohar about the slave in Shemitah. If you remember what we said about Yetzias Mitzrayim, that the intensity of Yetzias Mitzrayim is on Pesach night, and the rest of the year we only have to have a smaller version of the recalling of Yetzias Mitzrayim, but still equally valid and important. That's going to help us understand what the Zohar is telling us about a slave going free in Shemitah. There is a broad-based seventh year in the Jewish world. It's called Shemitah. It affects every Jew in Israel. And then there is the individualized 7-year cycle for the person who was sold as a slave. But both of them are a constant of a 7th year in a cycle. It's verständlich, because beide haben eine Zeit der Shabbos, so they must obviously have a common shared experience, a common denominator. Aber fragt man nicht dann, ist doch der Yochid Atel von Klal Yisrael, especially when you consider we're talking about an Eved Ivri who's Jewish, and therefore part of Klal Yisrael. So there's a Shemitah that affects Klal Yisrael, and there's a 7th year that affects him, the individual Eved. So what's the difference? Now the Chilek zwischen sie is the difference is by the Shana Shvis von Klal Yisrael is the Teichen von Shabbos Lashem B'Shleimus. When it's a Shemitah year, then resting for Hashem, which is what Shemitah is all about, is at the most ideal state, because everybody's resting. And the Rebbe brings him mit sich die alle halachos von Shemitah. That's why there's a lot of detail. Like, again, Pesach night is the ideal time to be telling the Yetzias Mitzrayim, so there's a lot of detail and a lot of ritual. Mashenkin in the Shana Shvis von HaYochid. But when it's the individual who's now going to be freed from slavery after his 7-year period, that's a miniature version of what's happening in Shemitah, because this is only affecting one person. On the Rebbe, das blazing Zainara is going to Chinam, and therefore the only way that you see it manifest in his life is his personal emancipation. Like when you mention Yetzias Mitzrayim during the year, where all you have is a single mention, and that's it. Und da sagt der Zohar, that's what the Zohar is telling us. The rest of the land is what compels us to give rest to the slave. And the Zohar doesn't disagree that practically when does an Eved go free? When he has been working for 6 years, his 7th year goes free. And why is it, says the Zohar? Because the Eved is a citizen of the Jewish community. The Jewish community has a thing called Shemitah, a year of freedom. He gets a piece of that. It comes into his experience. His personal emancipation is a miniature version of the Shemitah of the entire nation. And that gives us an incredible insight, which the Rebbe says apparently doesn't appear in other books. If the scenario is such, where the 7th year for this Eved coincides with the Shemitah for the whole community, that indicates that his freedom is different to the freedom of a regular slave. It's the most ideal, the most intense, most perfect form of freedom of a slave. And the Rebbe says we've got to think about what practical difference that would make. We're not going to get into the details here. That's why the Zohar leaves it fairly generic by saying in the rest of the Shemitah is the rest of the slave. Because because the Zohar wanted to leave it open-ended that you would think that we're talking about the slave going free specifically in Shemitah. But the Zohar bringt dort den Fall von Shvis jetzt lechaf shichinam wie sie ist bishleimosei, because it's similar to the Torah telling us mimochas hashabbos, because that's the ideal way to count Sfira. So here too the Zohar is saying that the slave goes out in Shemitah because that's actually the highest form of release of a slave. Der Fall was das der Fall, wenn die Mitzvah von Sfira ist bishleimosei, like we said about mochas hashabbos. Was das ist, wenn Shvis lemechira von dem Eved is in Ashnas Hashmita, Bahunaicha Da'ara, implying that as far as the Zohar is concerned, the very ultimate state of an Eved Ivri going free would be if his 7th year was in the 7th year of Shemitah as well. That's when he pulls all of the resource of Shemitah into his own freedom. And that, as the Rebbe says, leaves us with a lot of food for thought. What practical difference would that make? And why would we need to know that information? I guess it's something the Rebbe wants us to think about and study further.